In the remote Cascade Mountains, a solitary woman on horseback was about to uncover a secret that would shatter 20 years of isolation. What started as a routine supply run took a shocking turn when she discovered a hidden concrete bunker. Sarah Montgomery wasn't your typical mountain hermit. For 15 years, she had lived in self-imposed exile, known for her legendary search and rescue skills. When Thunder hesitated on a familiar trail, she had no idea she was walking into a decades-old conspiracy. Sarah's investigation would reveal her sister's true fate and a government cover-up involving illegal human experimentation. What began as curiosity about unusual rock formations would become a harrowing journey into darkness. The wilderness would never be the same. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thunder's hooves found their familiar rhythm against the mountain trail, each step a quiet percussion in the morning stillness. Sarah Montgomery shifted her weight in the saddle, her eyes scanning the terrain with the practiced attention of someone who'd spent 15 years learning every stone and shadow of these Cascade peaks. The supply run to Miller's Creek was routine, one of the few human interactions she allowed herself, and even then, only because her cabin's isolation demanded it. The October air carried the crisp bite of early winter, and Thunder's breath formed small clouds in the cold. Sarah pulled her wool jacket tighter, feeling the familiar comfort of solitude settle around her like a second skin. Up here, 30 miles from the nearest town, the world made sense. No expectations, no disappointments, no faces looking at her with that mixture of pity and curiosity she'd grown to hate. "Easy, boy," she murmured as Thunder's ears twitched forward, his pace slowing slightly. The horse had better instincts than most people she'd known, better than her ex-husband, who'd insisted she needed therapy to process Maria's disappearance, better than her former colleagues at Search and Rescue, who'd looked at her with barely concealed relief when she'd finally submitted her resignation. Thunder had appeared in her life 3 years into her self-imposed exile, a half-wild Mustang with rope burns on his neck and trust issues that matched her own. She'd found him limping through her property during a particularly brutal winter, and something in his wariness had recognized something in hers. The rehabilitation had been slow, careful work, teaching him that human hands could heal instead of hurt, that shelter didn't mean captivity. Now he paused at the edge of Widow's Ridge, a section of trail she'd traversed hundreds of times. His head turned toward something that made Sarah frown, a rock formation that looked wrong somehow. She'd noticed it before, but today something was different. "What is it?" she asked, dismounting with the fluid motion of someone who'd spent more time in the saddle than in any house over the past decade. Thunder nickered softly, his dark eyes fixed on the moss-covered outcropping about 50 yards off the main trail. Sarah approached on foot, her wilderness training automatically cataloging details. The rocks were too uniform, too angular for natural formation. As she drew closer, she could see places where the moss had been recently disturbed, not by weather or animals, but by deliberate human action. Fresh tool marks scarred the surface in places, revealing grey concrete beneath the careful camouflage. Her pulse quickened as recognition dawned. This wasn't a natural formation at all. Someone had gone to considerable effort to make this structure blend seamlessly with the mountainside, using techniques that spoke of military training or government resources, the kind of hiding that was meant to last decades. Thunder followed at a respectful distance as Sarah circled the structure, her search and rescue experience reading the signs that others would miss. Bootprints in the soft earth, partially obscured but recent. Maybe a week old, possibly less. Someone else had been here, someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. The entrance, when she found it, was a masterpiece of concealment. What appeared to be a natural crack between boulders was actually a carefully engineered doorway, complete with a heavy steel door painted to look like weathered stone. The handle was military-grade, designed to remain functional after decades of neglect. Sarah's hands hesitated over the metal, Every instinct honed by years of isolation screamed at her to leave this alone, to mount Thunder and ride back to the safety of her cabin. She'd built her life around avoiding complications, around keeping the world's darkness at bay. Whatever lay behind this door would bring nothing but trouble. But another part of her, the part that had once lived for the thrill of finding what others had given up for lost, felt the familiar pull of mystery. The same instinct that had made her one of the best search and rescue specialists in Washington state before Maria's disappearance had destroyed everything. Maria, the thought of her sister, brought the familiar ache, sharp as ever after 20 years. 16 years old and fearless, with a laugh that could light up the darkest mountain morning. The official report had been maddeningly simple. Hiking accident, body never recovered, case closed. Sarah had never accepted it, had searched every ravine and valley within 50 miles until exhaustion and grief had finally broken her. Thunder moved closer, pressing his warm nose against her shoulder in the gesture that had become his way of offering comfort. The horse had learned to read her moods, had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when the weight of the past threatened to drag her under. "I know, boy," she whispered, running her fingers through his dark mane. "I know we should leave this alone." But her hands were already examining the door mechanism, professional curiosity overriding caution. The locking system was complex, but not impossible, designed to keep out casual trespassers, but not someone with her particular skill set. More importantly, she could see that it had been opened recently. The metal showed fresh scratches where tools had worked the lock, and there were oil stains on the ground below. Someone had been inside this hidden place, someone who might still be around. The thought should have sent her running. Instead, it crystallized her resolve. 15 years of avoiding human contact had taught her to trust her instincts above all else, and those instincts were screaming that this was important. Whatever this place was, whoever had built it and hidden it so carefully, it was connected to something larger than a simple Cold War relic. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the mountain peaks, Sarah made her decision. She would return tomorrow with proper equipment, flashlights, tools, perhaps her old search and rescue camera. She would document whatever lay behind this door before anyone else could remove or destroy it. Thunder seemed to sense her resolution, his ears flicking forward as if approving her choice, or perhaps warning her about it. The ride back to her cabin passed in contemplative silence, both horse and rider lost in their own thoughts. Sarah found herself remembering details she'd pushed aside for years, inconsistencies in the official reports about Maria's disappearance, questions that had been discouraged rather than investigated, the way certain people had seemed eager to close the case and move on. By the time she reached her property, the sun was painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Her cabin sat in its familiar clearing, smoke rising from the chimney where she'd banked the fire that morning. It was a good life she'd built here, simple, honest, free from the complications and betrayals that had driven her to seek solitude. But as she unsaddled Thunder and settled him in his paddock with fresh hay and water, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully constructed peace was about to be shattered. The hidden door in the mountain had opened more than just a physical entrance. It had awakened something in her that she'd thought buried as deeply as Maria. The discovery would change everything. She knew it with the same certainty that had once made her legendary at finding the lost and bringing them home. The question was whether she was strong enough to face what lay hidden in the darkness, or if some truths were better left buried in the mountain's heart. Thunder whinnied softly from his paddock, and Sarah looked up to find him watching her with those intelligent dark eyes. In his gaze, she saw the same wariness that had brought them together, but also something else, a quiet strength that reminded her she wasn't as alone as she sometimes felt. Tomorrow would bring answers. Tonight, she would prepare for whatever those answers might cost her. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the heavy steel door handle, the metal cold, even through her work gloves. 24 hours had passed since her discovery. 24 hours of restless sleep, filled with half-remembered dreams of Maria's laughter echoing through mountain valleys. Thunder stood patient behind her, his reins tied to a sturdy pine, his dark eyes watching her with that quiet intelligence that never failed to ground her. The lock mechanism clicked open with surprising ease. Someone had maintained it well over the decades. Sarah's breath caught as the door swung inward on silent hinges, revealing a darkness that seemed to swallow her flashlight beam. The air that escaped carried scents that made her stomach clench. Disinfectant, rust, and something else she couldn't identify but instinctively feared. "Stay close, boy," she murmured to Thunder, though she knew the horse couldn't follow where she was about to go. The entrance tunnel stretched 15 feet into the mountainside before opening into what had clearly been designed as a reception area. Sarah's flashlight revealed concrete walls lined with metal filing cabinets, their surfaces remarkably preserved by the bunker's sealed environment. A reception desk sat against one wall, its surface still bearing the ghostly outline where equipment had once been mounted. But it was the smell that made Sarah pause, her wilderness-honed senses cataloguing details her conscious mind didn't want to process. Beneath the sterile scent of old disinfectant lay something organic and wrong, like the aftermath of fear made manifest. Her footsteps echoed in the silence as she moved deeper into the facility. The main corridor branched in 3 directions, and Sarah chose the left passage, following yellow lines painted on the floor that led toward what appeared to be the bunker's operational heart. The first room she encountered made her blood run cold. Medical equipment lined the walls, not the comforting instruments of healing, but restraint devices, IV stands, and monitoring equipment that spoke of procedures performed on unwilling subjects. Leather straps hung from examination tables, their surfaces darkened with stains she refused to identify. Sarah's camera clicked steadily as she documented everything, her professional training overriding the growing horror in her chest. This wasn't a military command bunker or civil defense shelter. This was something far more sinister, a place where human beings had been brought to suffer in secret. The filing cabinets yielded their secrets reluctantly, drawers sticking from decades of disuse. But when Sarah finally forced the first one open, manila folders spilled onto the floor, revealing typewritten reports that made her hands shake as she read. Subject 47. Female, approximately 16 years of age, acquired during routine wilderness patrol. The clinical language couldn't disguise the horror of what she was reading. Test subjects, drug trials, behavioral modification experiments, page after page of documented torture disguised as scientific research. Sarah's vision blurred as she photographed each document, her camera's flash creating stark shadows on the concrete walls. The dates on the reports spanned the 1990s, with the most recent entries dating to 1999, just 1 year after Maria's disappearance. It was in the 3rd filing cabinet that Sarah found the container marked Personal Effects, Subjects 4050. Her hands moved without conscious direction, lifting the metal box and setting it on the examination table under her flashlight's beam. The lid opened with a soft click that seemed to echo like thunder in the confined space. Inside, arranged with bureaucratic precision, were the belongings of the dead. Jewelry, watches, wallets, and small personal items that had once meant everything to someone and now served as catalogue entries in humanity's darkest archive. Sarah's flashlight beam caught silver, and her world stopped. A delicate chain bracelet lay coiled in one corner of the box, its surface tarnished but unmistakable. Maria had worn it every day since her 14th birthday, a gift from their grandmother that she'd claimed brought her luck on mountain hikes. Sarah had helped search teams look for that bracelet in every ravine and creek bed within 50 miles of Maria's last known location. No! The word escaped Sarah's lips as a whisper, but in the bunker's silence it sounded like a scream. Her knees buckled, and she found herself on the cold concrete floor, the bracelet clutched in her trembling hands. 20 years of carefully constructed defenses crumbled in an instant. The official story, hiking accident, body swept away by spring runoff, case closed, revealed itself as the lie she'd always known it was. Maria hadn't fallen from a cliff or been claimed by a river. She'd been taken, brought to this concrete tomb, and subjected to horrors that Sarah's mind refused to fully process. The panic attack hit like a physical blow, her chest constricting until each breath became a struggle. The bunker walls seemed to press inward, and for a terrifying moment, Sarah felt as if she were experiencing Maria's final moments. Trapped, helpless, alone in the darkness, while monsters wearing lab coats prepared their instruments. But even in the grip of overwhelming grief and rage, Sarah's survival instincts refused to abandon her. She forced herself to breathe deeply, to focus on the solid reality of the concrete beneath her knees and the familiar weight of the camera in her hands. Maria was beyond saving, but the truth wasn't. With mechanical precision born of years handling traumatic search and rescue situations, Sarah continued her documentation. Each photograph felt like a small act of rebellion against the forces that had tried to erase Maria's existence. The audio equipment in the corner looked functional despite its age, and Sarah spent precious minutes figuring out how to activate the playback system. The first recording made her stomach lurch, a man's voice, clinical and detached, describing the effects of an experimental compound on subject 23. But it was the fourth tape that stopped her heart completely. A young girl's voice, weak but unmistakably defiant, spoke from the decades-old recording. "My name is Maria Montgomery. My sister is Sarah. She's looking for me. She'll never stop looking for me." The words hit Sarah like physical blows, each syllable carrying the weight of love and faith that transcended death. Maria had known, even in her final days, that Sarah would keep searching, that someone would eventually find this place and learn the truth. Sarah's sobs echoed off the concrete walls as she clutched Maria's bracelet and listened to her sister's voice speaking across 20 years of silence. But beneath the grief, something harder was crystallizing, a cold rage that promised justice for Maria and all the others who had died in this place. The camera's memory card was nearly full by the time Sarah forced herself to leave the bunker, but she had documented everything she could find. Names, dates, procedures, and most importantly, evidence that this wasn't the work of rogue actors, but an organized program with official backing. Thunder nickered softly as she emerged into the fading daylight, and Sarah realized she'd been underground for over 3 hours. The normal world seemed impossibly bright and clean after the bunker's sterile horror, but she knew she would never see it the same way again. As she secured the bunker door and began the ride back to her cabin, Sarah's mind was already racing ahead. She couldn't handle this alone. The conspiracy was too large, the evidence too dangerous. For the first time in 15 years, she would have to trust another human being with something that mattered. Marcus Webb's business card lay in her cabin's junk drawer, yellowed with age, but still legible. Maria's former boyfriend had become a journalist, she'd heard, still chasing the truth about cases the authorities preferred to forget. Tomorrow, she would make the call that would end her isolation forever. Tonight, she would mourn her sister and plan for justice. The business card felt like fragile parchment between Sarah's fingers as she sat at her kitchen table, Thunder's gentle breathing audible through the open window where he grazed in the early morning light. Marcus Webb, investigative journalist, the faded text read, followed by a phone number she'd memorized and tried to forget a dozen times over the past 2 decades. She'd found the card 3 years ago while sorting through a box of Maria's belongings she'd finally worked up the courage to open. Marcus had pressed it into her hand at Maria's memorial service, his eyes red-rimmed and desperate as he'd whispered, "If you ever want to know the truth about what happened, call me. I won't stop looking." Sarah had thrown it away that night, then retrieved it from the trash an hour later, unable to explain why she couldn't let it go completely. The coffee in her mug had grown cold as she stared at Maria's bracelet, now cleaned and lying beside the card like an accusation. The recording of her sister's voice played on endless repeat in her memory. "She's looking for me. She'll never stop looking for me." But Sarah had stopped looking. After 18 months of fruitless searches, of following every lead and chasing every shadow, she'd finally accepted the official story and retreated to this mountain sanctuary. She told herself it was grief that drove her into isolation, but now she recognized it for what it truly was: cowardice. Fear of facing the possibility that Maria's disappearance was more than a tragic accident. The phone felt impossibly heavy in her hands as she dialed the number. Each ring stretched into eternity until a familiar voice answered, rougher now but unmistakably Marcus. Webb. It's Sarah. The words scraped her throat like broken glass. Sarah Montgomery. The silence on the other end lasted so long, she wondered if the connection had failed. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice carried 20 years of hope and exhaustion. Jesus, Sarah, I never thought. Where are you? Are you all right? I'm fine. The lie came automatically, a defense mechanism honed by years of deflecting concern. I need to see you. About Maria. Another silence, shorter this time, but weighted with understanding. You found something. It wasn't a question. Marcus had always been able to read her too well, even when they were barely more than strangers, united only by their love for the same brilliant, headstrong girl. Can you come to the mountains? I can't. I can't leave right now. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Text me the coordinates. I'll be there by noon. The call ended without pleasantries, leaving Sarah alone with the echoing silence of her cabin and the weight of what she'd just set in motion. For 15 years, she'd maintained perfect isolation, seeing other humans only during her infrequent supply runs to town. Now she'd invited the past back into her carefully constructed sanctuary. Thunder lifted his head as the sound of an approaching vehicle broke the morning stillness. Sarah watched from her window as a battered Subaru wound up the narrow dirt road to her property, its engine coughing with the effort of the climb. The man who emerged was recognizably Marcus beneath the changes time had wrought. The same lean build and intelligent eyes. But his dark hair was now streaked with premature grey, and his face carried lines that spoke of too many sleepless nights and too much bitter knowledge. He stood beside his car for a long moment, taking in the sight of Sarah's cabin, the well-tended garden, Thunder grazing peacefully in his paddock. When his gaze finally found Sarah standing in her doorway, she saw him flinch slightly at whatever changes he observed in her. You look good, he said, though they both knew it was a kindness. Healthy. The mountains suit you. Sarah stepped aside to let him enter, noting the slight tremor in his hands that spoke of struggles she recognized but wouldn't name. The flask bulge in his jacket pocket told its own story of how Marcus had been coping with the weight of unanswered questions. Coffee's fresh, she offered, falling back on the rituals of hospitality to navigate the awkwardness of reconnection. Marcus accepted the mug gratefully, his fingers wrapping around it as if drawing warmth from more than just the liquid. You said you found something about Maria. Sarah placed the bracelet on the table between them, watching as Marcus's face went white with recognition. His hand reached out instinctively, then stopped short of touching the delicate silver chain. Where? The question came out as barely a whisper, but Sarah heard the years of desperate hope and growing despair behind it. She told him about the bunker, about the documents and recordings, about the clinical horror of Project Nightfall. With each revelation, Marcus's expression grew harder, his journalist's instincts cataloging details even as his grief threatened to overwhelm him. When she played Maria's recording on the small digital recorder she'd brought from the bunker, Marcus broke completely. The sound that escaped him was raw and animal. 20 years of suppressed anguish given voice. Sarah found herself moving to his side, her hand settling on his shoulder in the first voluntary human contact she'd initiated in over a decade. She knew, Marcus gasped between ragged breaths. She knew you'd find her eventually. I should have found her sooner. The words carried the weight of 2 decades worth of self-recrimination. I was the search and rescue specialist. Finding people was what I did, but I couldn't find my own sister. Marcus lifted his head, his eyes blazing with the intensity that had first attracted Maria to him all those years ago. You found her now. That's what matters. He pulled a worn laptop from his messenger bag, his movements gaining purpose as his professional instincts took over. I've been investigating disappearances from that time period for years, cases that followed similar patterns. Young people vanishing in wilderness areas, searches called off too quickly, families pressured to accept accident explanations. The screen filled with files, photographs, and newspaper clippings as Marcus laid out the fruits of his obsessive research. Names and faces that would never grow older, families destroyed by loss and unanswered questions, official stonewalling disguised as bureaucratic incompetence. There were 17 cases between 1995 and 1999 in Washington and Oregon alone, Marcus explained, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. All fitting the same profile, young, healthy individuals disappearing in remote areas. All investigations terminated within weeks of the initial search. Sarah studied the photographs with the clinical detachment she'd once applied to search grids and evidence collection. But when Marcus pulled up a map showing the locations of the disappearances, her blood ran cold. They're all within a 100-mile radius of the bunker, she breathed. Hunting grounds, Marcus confirmed grimly. Whoever was running Project Nightfall had a systematic approach to acquiring test subjects. Remote areas, limited witnesses, plausible explanations for why bodies might never be recovered. The enormity of the conspiracy began to crystallize as they worked through the files together. This wasn't the work of a single rogue scientist or isolated facility. The coordination required, the official support needed to maintain such secrecy, it reached into the highest levels of government and military command. We need to be careful, Sarah said, her wilderness-honed survival instincts finally catching up with her emotional response. If this operation was as extensive as it appears, there are people with a lot to lose if the truth comes out. People with resources and connections. Marcus nodded, closing the laptop with deliberate care. I've been careful for 20 years. Sometimes I think that's why I'm still alive. I've never gotten close enough to threaten them directly. But now we have proof. Sarah picked up Maria's bracelet, feeling its weight like a sacred trust. Real evidence, not just patterns and suspicions. The afternoon sun was slanting low through the cabin windows by the time they finished comparing notes and planning their next moves. Marcus would return to Seattle to research Dr. James Carver's background and current activities. Sarah would document everything in the bunker more thoroughly and secure the evidence. As Marcus prepared to leave, he turned back at the cabin door with the expression of someone working up courage for a difficult conversation. Sarah, I need to ask you something. About that night. The night Maria disappeared. Sarah's body tensed automatically, but she nodded for him to continue. You blamed yourself for not finding her. But I always wondered, did you ever suspect that someone didn't want her found? The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Sarah thought back to those frantic weeks of searching, remembering details she'd tried to forget. The search called off too early. The reluctance of certain officials to provide resources. The subtle pressure to accept the accident theory and move on. Yes, she admitted quietly, I suspected. But I didn't want to believe it because that would have meant that you weren't fighting against nature or bad luck. You were fighting against people who had every advantage and no intention of letting you win. Marcus's words gave shape to fears Sarah had never quite articulated, even to herself. The realization brought a strange sense of relief. Her failure to find Maria hadn't been a failure of skill or dedication, but the inevitable result of being systematically deceived by those she'd trusted to help. As Marcus's taillights disappeared down the mountain road, Sarah felt the weight of her isolation lifting for the first time in years. She wasn't alone in her quest for truth anymore, but with that relief came a new fear. If Marcus was right about the scope of the conspiracy, they were about to make themselves targets of people who had already proven they would kill to protect their secrets. Thunder nickered softly from his paddock, sensing her unease. Sarah walked over to rest her forehead against his warm neck, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "We're going to finish this, boy," she whispered. Da-de-de-tun, Tom. For Maria, for all of them." The mountain evening settled around them with its familiar peace. But Sarah knew it was the calm before a storm that would test everything she'd learned about survival in the 20 years since her world first shattered. This time she wouldn't face it alone. The bunker's darkness felt different with Marcus beside her, less oppressive but somehow more sinister. His flashlight beam swept methodically across the concrete walls as they descended into the facility's depths. His journalist's training evident in the way he documented everything with quiet, professional precision. "The filing system is incredibly organized," Marcus observed, pulling manila folders from the cabinets they hadn't fully explored during Sarah's first visit. "Whoever ran this operation wanted detailed records." Sarah nodded grimly, photographing each document as Marcus examined it. The bureaucratic efficiency of the horror was almost worse than chaos would have been. It spoke of systematic planning, of people who treated human suffering as data points in carefully maintained spreadsheets. Here, Marcus's voice carried a note of discovery that made Sarah look up from her camera. Project Nightfall. Official designation: psychological and pharmacological response studies in isolated populations. The folder he'd opened contained dozens of official memoranda, budget allocations, and progress reports. Sarah's flashlight illuminated the letterhead: Department of Defense, Psychological Operations Division. Beneath that, a name that appeared on document after document. "Dr. James Carver, Project Director," Sarah read aloud. "Have you heard that name before?" Marcus was already pulling out his phone, fingers moving rapidly across the screen, despite the bunker's lack of signal. "I'll research him when we get back to the surface. But look at these dates. The project ran from 1993 to 1999, with peak activity between 97 and 98. The timeline sent chills through Sarah's body. Maria had disappeared in October 1998, right in the middle of Project Nightfall's most active period. She forced herself to continue photographing documents, while Marcus read aloud the clinical descriptions of psychological torture disguised as scientific research. "Subject acquisition protocols," Marcus read, his voice growing tighter with each word. "Remote locations preferred for initial contact. Subjects should be isolated from immediate support networks. Preference for individuals whose disappearance can be attributed to environmental hazards." Sarah's hands stilled on her camera as the full implications sank in. They were hunting people, specifically targeting individuals who could disappear without raising immediate suspicions. "Young hikers," Marcus confirmed grimly. "Runaways. Anyone society might write off as having made poor choices or taken unnecessary risks." The audio equipment took longer to activate this time, its decades-old electronics requiring careful coaxing. But when the first recording crackled to life, both Sarah and Marcus froze at the sound of Dr. Carver's voice, cultured, precise, and utterly devoid of empathy. Day 15 of Protocol 7, Subject 47 continues to show resistance to conditioning despite escalated pharmaceutical intervention. Note increased defiance behaviors, including attempted communication with other subjects and refusal to comply with dietary restrictions. Sarah's breath caught. Subject 47, the same number from the file that had contained Maria's bracelet. The recording continued. Carver's clinical observations painting a picture of systematic psychological torture designed to break down human will and identity. But it was the next recording that shattered what remained of Sarah's composure. A young girl's voice, weak but unmistakably Maria's, speaking with the stubborn courage that had defined her since childhood. "My name is Maria Montgomery. I'm 16 years old. My sister Sarah is a search and rescue specialist. She's looking for me, and she won't stop until she finds me. When she does, everyone involved in this will pay for what they've done." Marcus reached out instinctively, his hand finding Sarah's shoulder as she fought to maintain her professional detachment. The recording continued, revealing Maria's intelligence and determination even in captivity. She'd somehow managed to observe and remember details about the facility, the personnel, the other subjects. "There are at least 12 other kids here," Maria's voice continued from beyond the grave. "The youngest looks maybe 14. They call us by numbers, but I remember names. Jenny from Portland, Michael from Spokane, Lisa, who was hitchhiking to California to see her boyfriend." Sarah's camera clicked steadily as she documented everything, but her mind was reeling with the scope of what they'd uncovered. This wasn't just about Maria. It was about dozens of young people who'd been systematically abducted, tortured, and murdered by their own government. "Look at this," Marcus called from the corner, where he'd been examining a large metal cabinet. Inside, vacuum-sealed containers held personal effects from dozens of victims. Jewelry, clothing, identification cards, the remnants of lives cut short in service of someone's twisted definition of national security. As they worked deeper into the bunker's archives, a pattern emerged that made Sarah's blood run cold. The disappearances hadn't been random. They'd been carefully coordinated with local law enforcement and search and rescue operations. Official reports had been falsified, searches called off prematurely, evidence suppressed or destroyed. They had people inside, Sarah realized, her voice echoing in the concrete chamber. Inside the police departments, the ranger stations, maybe even my own unit. That's why we never found anything. The people we trusted to help were working against us. Marcus nodded grimly, holding up a folder marked Local Asset Management. Inside were lists of names, positions, and payment records that revealed the scope of the corruption. Sheriff's deputies, forest rangers, even coroners, all receiving regular payments to ensure Project Nightfall's activities remained hidden. The final piece of the puzzle lay in Dr. Carver's personal files, sealed in a separate container marked Insurance. The documents revealed his current identity and location. No longer a government scientist, but the CEO of Meridian Pharmaceuticals, a company specializing in psychiatric medications. "He's still out there," Sarah whispered, staring at a recent photograph of Carver at a medical conference. Older now, distinguished grey hair and expensive suit, but the same cold eyes that had overseen the systematic murder of children like Maria. As they prepared to leave the bunker, Marcus loaded the final batch of files into his messenger bag. The weight of evidence they'd gathered was overwhelming, enough to expose not just Carver, but an entire network of corruption that had enabled Project Nightfall's horrors. But as they sealed the bunker door behind them and emerged into the mountain afternoon, Sarah felt the weight of invisible eyes upon them. Thunder was pacing restlessly in the clearing where they'd left him, his ears pricked forward in alert attention to something beyond human perception. "We need to move carefully," Sarah said, her wilderness instincts screaming danger. "If Carver's built a new life on the foundation of those deaths, he won't hesitate to kill again to protect it." Marcus nodded, his journalist's paranoia finally matching Sarah's survival-honed caution. They'd found the truth Maria had died trying to preserve. Now they had to survive long enough to share it with the world. Dr. James Carver's fingers drummed against the mahogany surface of his executive desk as he reviewed the security report for the third time. Meridian Pharmaceuticals' headquarters occupied the top 3 floors of a Seattle high-rise, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of Elliott Bay, but Carver's attention was fixed on the grainy surveillance photographs scattered before him. A woman on horseback, a man with a camera, both standing outside a concrete structure that should have been invisible to anyone, without specific coordinates and authorization codes that had been classified beyond top secret for over 2 decades. "How long have they been watching the site?" Carver asked, without looking up at the man standing beside his desk. "Motion sensors were triggered 3 days ago," replied David Nash, Carver's head of corporate security and a former military intelligence operative who asked very few questions about his employer's past. "Initial assessment suggested animal activity, but yesterday's footage confirms human presence. Carver studied the photographs more carefully. The woman's face was partially obscured by the angle, but something about her posture, the way she moved through the wilderness with practiced confidence, stirred a memory he'd thought buried. The man was easier to identify. Facial recognition software had provided a name within hours. Marcus Webb, investigative journalist, former boyfriend of Subject 47. The connection sent ice through Carver's veins. In 30 years of covering his tracks, maintaining his new identity, building Meridian into a pharmaceutical empire worth billions, he'd never encountered anyone with direct personal connections to Project Nightfall. The families of the disappeared had eventually stopped asking questions, worn down by bureaucratic stonewalling and the simple passage of time. But Webb had never stopped digging, never stopped writing his conspiracy theories for obscure online publications that no one in power took seriously. Until now. "Run enhanced identification on the woman," Carver ordered, his voice carrying the calm authority that had made him legendary in certain circles. "I want to know who she is, where she lives, and how she found that location." Nash nodded and moved toward the door, but Carver's next words stopped him cold. "And activate the Montana team. Full surveillance protocols prepare for asset retrieval." The euphemisms rolled off Carver's tongue with practiced ease, but both men understood their true meaning. The Montana team consisted of former special operations personnel who handled problems that couldn't be resolved through legal or financial means. Asset retrieval was corporate speak for eliminating threats to company security. While Nash coordinated the response from Seattle, Sarah and Marcus were discovering that the mountain's isolation offered less protection than they'd hoped. Thunder had been restless for 2 days, his ears constantly pricked towards sounds only he could detect. Sarah's wilderness instincts, honed by years of survival in the backcountry, screamed warnings she couldn't quite articulate. "Someone's been here," she said, examining the area around her cabin with the methodical precision she'd once applied to search grids. The signs were subtle: disturbed earth around the windows, a twig broken in an unnatural pattern, Thunder's water trough moved 2 inches from its usual position. Marcus looked up from his laptop, where he'd been researching Dr. Carver's background. "Are you sure? I don't see anything." "That's the point," Sarah replied, her hand instinctively moving to check the rifle she now kept within easy reach. "Professional surveillance leaves minimal traces, but it does leave traces if you know what to look for." The research Marcus had compiled painted a picture of Dr. James Carver's transformation from government scientist to pharmaceutical mogul. After Project Nightfall's official termination in 1999, Carver had seamlessly transitioned to the private sector, using classified research data to develop a new generation of psychiatric medications that had made him wealthy beyond imagination. "He's not just covering up past crimes," Marcus explained, showing Sarah the financial documents he'd uncovered. "He's built his entire fortune on research stolen from his victims. Every patent, every breakthrough drug, it's all based on data collected during those experiments." Sarah studied the photographs of Carver at medical conferences and charity galas. His distinguished appearance and philanthropic reputation, the perfect mask for someone who'd built his success on systematic murder. Which means he has everything to lose if the truth comes out. His company, his reputation, probably his freedom. "And the resources to make sure that never happens," Marcus added grimly. Their conversation was interrupted by Thunder's sharp whinny of alarm. Sarah moved to the window, her trained eyes scanning the tree line for movement. There, a glint of metal catching afternoon sunlight from a position that offered perfect sightlines to her cabin. "We need to leave. Now." Sarah's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to making life-or-death decisions under pressure. "Grab the essential evidence. Everything else we can replace." Marcus didn't argue, shoving the most critical documents into his messenger bag while Sarah gathered her survival gear. But as they prepared to flee into the wilderness that had been her sanctuary for 15 years, Sarah realized with cold clarity that running would only delay the inevitable. "They found us once," she said, loading ammunition into her rifle with practiced efficiency. "They'll find us again, and next time they won't just be watching." Thunder was saddled and ready within minutes, his training as a wilderness mount evident in his calm response to Sarah's urgent preparations. But as they prepared to mount up, the sound of approaching vehicles echoed through the mountain valley, multiple engines moving fast and with obvious purpose. "Too late," Sarah breathed, recognizing the coordinated approach of a tactical team. "They're not just watching anymore." The first shot shattered her cabin's front window, and Sarah's world exploded into the chaos of combat. Her military-trained instincts took over as she and Marcus dove for cover behind Thunder's bulk, the big horse standing steady despite the gunfire erupting around them. "This way!" Sarah shouted, grabbing Thunder's reins and leading him toward the tree line where the dense forest would provide both cover and concealment. Marcus followed, clutching his bag of evidence and trying to stay low as bullets whined overhead. Sarah's knowledge of the terrain became their salvation as she led them along game trails, invisible to anyone without her expertise. Behind them, she could hear their pursuers spreading out, their professional coordination evident in their tactical movements. These weren't random criminals or corporate security guards. They were military contractors with the training and equipment to hunt people through some of the most challenging terrain in North America. But they were hunting on Sarah Montgomery's home ground, and she had advantages they couldn't anticipate. 15 years of living in these mountains had taught her every game trail, every hidden valley, every place where a horse and two desperate people could disappear into the wilderness like ghosts. As they climbed higher into the backcountry, Thunder's breathing steady despite the pace, Sarah felt the familiar calm of someone operating in their element. These mountains had been her refuge after Maria's disappearance, the place where she'd learned to survive alone. Now they would have to serve as a battleground where she fought not just for her own life, but for justice for her sister and all the others who died in Project Nightfall's concrete tomb. Behind them, radio chatter echoed through the forest as their hunters coordinated their search patterns. Professional voices discussing search sectors and containment strategies, treating the pursuit of two civilians like a military operation, which Sarah realized with growing dread was exactly what it was. Dr. Carver wasn't just covering up his crimes, he was conducting a new operation, using the same ruthless efficiency that had made Project Nightfall possible. The only difference was that this time Sarah knew she was being hunted. As darkness began to fall across the Cascade Peaks, Sarah led Marcus and Thunder deeper into the wilderness that had shaped her into the survivor she'd become. The evidence they carried could expose decades of corruption and murder, but first they had to live long enough to share it with the world. In the growing twilight, the sound of their pursuers faded to an ominous silence that Sarah knew was far more dangerous than open pursuit. The real hunt was about to begin. Sheriff David Rodriguez sat in his patrol car outside the Cascade County Courthouse, staring at the manila envelope that had arrived by courier that morning. No return address, no postmark, just his name written in block letters across cream-colored paper that felt expensive between his fingers. Inside were photographs that made his stomach clench with recognition and 20-year-old guilt. The concrete bunker he'd helped search teams avoid in 1998, documents bearing official letterheads he'd hoped never to see again. And most damning of all, a copy of a payment voucher with his signature at the bottom, compensation for consultation services during the Maria Montgomery investigation. His radio crackled to life with dispatch coordinates that sent ice through his veins. Shots fired at a remote mountain property. Multiple units requested. The address matched the location where Sarah Montgomery had been living in isolation for the past 15 years. Rodriguez's hands shook as he started the patrol car. He'd known this day would come eventually, had rehearsed the conversation in his head countless times over the years. The young deputy who'd taken money to misdirect searches and falsify reports had grown into a sheriff who'd spent 2 decades trying to atone for his compromises. But atonement meant nothing if Sarah Montgomery was dead because of choices he'd made when he was 25 and drowning in student loan debt. The mountain road to Sarah's property was blocked by unmarked vehicles with government plates. Rodriguez badged his way through the perimeter, noting the professional setup and the faces he recognized from federal law enforcement databases. These weren't local contractors. They were the same kind of people who'd coordinated Project Nightfall's cover-up. Sheriff Rodriguez. The man who approached wore tactical gear, but carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding operations. Agent Kellerman, DOD, we have a domestic terrorism situation here. 2 suspects, armed and dangerous, fled into the wilderness. Rodriguez studied the smoking ruins of Sarah's cabin, the bullet holes in nearby trees, the tactical equipment being loaded back into vehicles. Domestic terrorism. What exactly are they accused of? Theft of classified materials, potential sale to foreign interests. Kellerman's tone suggested the conversation was a courtesy, not a negotiation. Local law enforcement assistance is appreciated, but not required. The lie came so smoothly that Rodriguez almost admired its audacity. But he'd heard similar lies 20 years ago, had been young and desperate enough to believe them. Not anymore. I'll need to see the warrant, Rodriguez said calmly, his hand resting on his service weapon, in a gesture that wasn't quite threatening but conveyed serious intent. Kellerman's expression hardened. Sheriff, I think there's been a misunderstanding about jurisdiction here. No misunderstanding. Rodriguez's voice carried the authority he'd built over 2 decades of legitimate law enforcement. This is my county. These are my people. And Sarah Montgomery isn't a terrorist. She's a victim who finally found the courage to seek justice. The standoff might have escalated, but Rodriguez's radio crackled with an incoming call that changed everything. Dr. Rachel Martinez's voice, calm and professional despite the encrypted channel they were using. David, we need to meet. I have information about Project Nightfall that you're going to want to hear. 40 miles south, Dr. Rachel Martinez was reviewing case files in her private practice office when her secure phone rang. Marcus Webb's voice was strained, but determined as he explained the situation from whatever hidden location he and Sarah had reached. We need an expert who understands government medical experiments, Marcus said. Someone who won't dismiss what we've found as conspiracy theories. Rachel closed her eyes, remembering her own encounter with institutional corruption during her military service. The psychiatric ward at Fort Detrick, where she'd discovered unauthorized drug trials on soldiers diagnosed with PTSD, the colleagues who'd warned her to keep quiet, the career destruction that had followed when she'd chosen to speak out instead. I can help, she said simply. But you need to understand, once we expose this, there's no going back. They'll come after all of us. They're already coming after us, Marcus replied grimly. The question is whether we face them alone or together. 2 hours later, Rachel met Sheriff Rodriguez at a truck stop halfway between their locations. The meeting was awkward at first. She'd heard rumors about local law enforcement complicity in cover-ups, while he was clearly struggling with guilt over his past compromises. I took their money, Rodriguez said without preamble, his honesty cutting through the tension. 20 years ago, I was a deputy with more debt than sense. They paid me to misdirect search efforts, to lose evidence, to encourage families to accept official explanations. Rachel studied his face, seeing the weight of decades-old guilt, but also genuine remorse. What changed? I became sheriff, started seeing the bigger picture of what those compromises cost. Maria Montgomery wasn't the only victim. There were others over the years, cases that got buried or misdirected. Rodriguez pulled out a thick folder. I've been keeping records, trying to document what I could remember. Insurance, I guess. Or maybe just penance. The files Rodriguez had compiled painted a picture of systematic corruption that extended far beyond Project Nightfall. Missing persons cases handled with suspicious efficiency. Evidence that disappeared from storage. Forensic reports that were never filed or were filed with conclusions that defied physical evidence. There's someone else you need to meet, Rachel said, pulling out her own phone. Tommy Carver. He's a park ranger, but more importantly, he's Dr. James Carver's son. The call to Tommy took longer to arrange. He was finishing a backcountry patrol and wouldn't reach a secure communication point for several hours. But when the connection finally went through, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd been expecting this conversation for years. "I've suspected something about my father's past for a long time," Tommy said, his words carefully measured. "Military records that don't quite add up. Research papers he published that seem to come out of nowhere. The way he reacts when certain topics come up in conversation." Rachel and Rodriguez exchanged glances. Having Dr. Carver's own son as a potential ally could provide access and insights they couldn't obtain any other way. "There's more," Tommy continued. "I've been monitoring unusual activity in the wilderness areas around the old military installations. Vehicles in places they shouldn't be, equipment being moved at night. I think my father's people have been maintaining surveillance on sites that were supposed to have been decommissioned decades ago." The implications were staggering. Project Nightfall hadn't just been covered up. It had been actively protected, monitored, and prepared for exactly the kind of exposure Sarah and Marcus had stumbled into. "We need to coordinate," Rachel said, her clinical training taking over as she organized the complex web of information and relationships. "Sarah and Marcus have the physical evidence. David has local jurisdiction and knowledge of the cover-up network. Tommy has access to his father's current operations. And I have expertise in the psychological and medical aspects of what was done to those victims." Rodriguez nodded slowly. "It's going to be dangerous. Dr. Carver has resources we can't match, and he's already shown he's willing to kill to protect his secrets." "Then we'd better make sure we survive long enough to expose him," Rachel replied. "Because if we don't, Maria Montgomery and all the others will have died for nothing." As they coordinated their next moves, none of them spoke about the obvious risks they were taking. Each had reasons for choosing to stand against forces that had proven capable of making people disappear without a trace. For Rodriguez, it was redemption. For Rachel, it was justice delayed but not denied. For Tommy, it was the chance to finally confront the darkness he'd always sensed in his father's past. But for all of them, it was the recognition that some truths were worth dying for, and that Sarah Montgomery had already sacrificed too much of her life to the silence that had protected Project Nightfall's architects. In the wilderness above them, Sarah and Marcus continued their desperate flight, unaware that help was finally coming. But help that might arrive too late to save them from the hunters closing in through the mountain darkness. Tommy Carver's hands trembled as he stared at the secure message on his ranger station computer. The coordinates matched a location he'd been monitoring for weeks. Unusual equipment movements, unmarked vehicles, activities that had no business occurring in protected wilderness areas. But now, Sheriff Rodriguez was requesting an emergency meeting at those exact coordinates, claiming Sarah Montgomery and Marcus Webb were under armed pursuit by his father's operatives. The weight of genetic loyalty battled against moral conviction as Tommy read the encrypted details. His father, the distinguished pharmaceutical executive who'd paid for Tommy's education and supported his career choice despite their philosophical differences, was revealed as the architect of systematic murder disguised as scientific research. Tommy's radio crackled with routine Park Service communications, but his mind was racing through years of half-noticed details that suddenly formed a horrifying pattern. His father's unexplained wealth in the early 2000s, the way conversations died when Tommy entered certain rooms during family gatherings, the locked study that had always been off-limits, even when Tommy was an adult. "Ranger Carver, we have a situation developing in Sector 7, dispatch reported. Multiple unknown vehicles, possible poaching operation. Sector 7 encompassed the area where Sarah and Marcus were being hunted." Tommy's jaw tightened as he realized his own Park Service was being manipulated, their resources redirected to support his father's operation. "Copy that, dispatch. I'm en route to investigate." But instead of heading to Sector 7, Tommy drove toward the rendezvous point, where Rodriguez, Dr. Martinez, and whatever backup they could muster were preparing their desperate rescue attempt. Meanwhile, high in the mountain wilderness, Sarah pressed herself against a granite outcropping as the sound of helicopter rotors echoed through the valley below. Thunder stood motionless behind her, his training as a wilderness mount evident in his ability to remain calm despite the obvious danger. "They've brought air support," Marcus whispered, his breath visible in the thin mountain air. "We can't outrun helicopters." Sarah's mind raced through tactical options, her search and rescue experience providing knowledge that might save their lives. "We don't need to outrun them. We need to get where they can't follow." She pointed toward a series of narrow canyons that cut deep into the mountain face, terrain too dangerous for helicopter insertion and too narrow for effective aerial surveillance. But reaching those canyons meant crossing nearly a mile of open ground, where they'd be exposed to both aircraft and ground teams. "The weather's changing," Sarah observed, noting the clouds building over the peaks. "Mountain storm coming in fast. That'll ground their aircraft, but it also means we're about to be dealing with rain, possibly snow, and zero visibility." As if summoned by her words, the first fat raindrops began to fall, quickly building to a steady downpour that reduced visibility to mere yards. Sarah made her decision with the quick calculation of someone whose survival had always depended on reading natural signs. "Now, move fast, stay low, and trust Thunder to find the path." They emerged from cover into the storm's embrace, Sarah leading Thunder by his reins, while Marcus struggled to keep pace across the treacherous terrain. The rain was both blessing and curse. It masked their movement, but made every step potentially lethal on the slick mountain stone. Behind them, radio chatter filled the storm as their pursuers adapted to the changing conditions. Professional voices coordinating search patterns, discussing thermal imaging capabilities, and requesting ground team repositioning. These weren't random corporate security guards. They were military contractors with the equipment and training to hunt people through some of the most challenging terrain in North America. But they were hunting on Sarah Montgomery's home ground, where 15 years of solitude had taught her every game trail, every hidden shelter, every place where the mountain's geography could be used as both weapon and sanctuary. The narrow canyon Sarah had identified proved to be their salvation. Its walls rose hundreds of feet on either side, creating a natural corridor that was invisible from the air and too narrow for vehicle pursuit. But it was also a potential death trap. If their hunters could position teams at both ends, Sarah and Marcus would be caught with nowhere to run. "We need to reach the other end before they can set up containment," Sarah explained, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Adite, it's about 3 miles through some of the most dangerous terrain in the Cascades. One wrong step and we're dead." Marcus nodded grimly, understanding that they had no choice. Behind them, the sound of approaching ground teams grew louder despite the storm. Ahead lay a canyon that had claimed the lives of experienced climbers and wilderness guides who'd attempted it under ideal conditions. They were halfway through the canyon when Tommy Carver's voice crackled over Sarah's emergency radio, a channel she'd monitored but never used during her years of isolation. "Sarah Montgomery, this is Park Ranger Tommy Carver. I'm with Sheriff Rodriguez and Dr. Martinez. We're moving to intercept the teams hunting you, but you need to know, my father has resources we can't match. You need to get to high ground and signal for legitimate federal backup." Sarah's finger hesitated over the radio's transmit button. Trusting anyone felt like betrayal of the self-reliance that had kept her alive. But the sound of helicopter rotors returning as the storm began to clear forced her decision. "This is Sarah Montgomery. We're in Devil's Canyon, moving northeast toward the old mining camp. The evidence we've gathered proves Project Nightfall existed and that Dr. Carver was responsible for my sister's death." Tommy's response was immediate and filled with anguish. "I know, I'm sorry. I should have suspected years ago, should have investigated the inconsistencies in his stories. I'm going to help you stop him." "Uldudum." The radio exchange was brief, but Sarah caught something in Tommy's voice that resonated with her own guilt over Maria's disappearance. The weight of family loyalty conflicting with moral duty. The recognition that sometimes the people we trust most are capable of unimaginable evil. As they emerged from Devil's Canyon onto a narrow ridge that offered commanding views of the surrounding valleys, Sarah realized they'd gained more than tactical advantage. They'd gained allies, people willing to risk their own lives to ensure that Maria and the other victims of Project Nightfall would finally receive justice. But they'd also attracted the full attention of Dr. Carver's network. Below them, Sarah could see vehicles converging from multiple directions, their coordinated movement speaking of military-level planning and resources. In the distance, the helicopter had resumed its search pattern, now equipped with thermal imaging equipment that would make hiding impossible once full darkness fell. Thunder nickered softly, his ears pricked toward sounds only he could detect. Sarah followed his gaze and felt ice form in her stomach. A second helicopter was approaching from the north, this one bearing federal law enforcement markings that might be legitimate or might be another element of Carver's deception. "We're about to find out who we can really trust," Sarah said grimly, checking her rifle and ensuring the evidence they'd gathered was secure in Marcus's waterproof bag. As the mountain storm cleared and revealed the full scope of the forces arrayed against them, Sarah Montgomery prepared for the fight that would determine whether her sister's voice would finally be heard or whether Project Nightfall's secrets would be buried forever beneath the weight of official denial and corporate power. The hunt had become a battle, and the stakes were nothing less than justice for the dead and survival for the living. In the valley below, Tommy Carver made his final choice between blood and conscience, while Sheriff Rodriguez and Dr. Martinez coordinated with federal agents whose loyalty remained uncertain. The truth about Project Nightfall hung in the balance, dependent on the courage of people who'd found each other too late to prevent tragedy, but perhaps just in time to ensure it was never forgotten. The abandoned mining camp sat like a ghost town on the mountain ridge, its weathered buildings offering the first real shelter Sarah and Marcus had found since fleeing her cabin. Thunder stood guard in what had once been a stable, his ears constantly rotating as he monitored the sounds of pursuit that seemed to come from every direction. Dr. Rachel Martinez's voice crackled through Sarah's emergency radio as she and Sheriff Rodriguez coordinated with Tommy Carver's position. "We've established a perimeter with the federal agents who responded to our call. They're legitimate FBI, not Carver's people. But his private contractors are still out there, and they're not backing down." Sarah pressed herself against the window of the mining camp's main building, watching the valley below, where flashlight beams moved in coordinated search patterns. "How long can you hold them?" "Not long," Rodriguez's voice was grim. "Carver's people have military-grade equipment and training. We're outgunned and outnumbered." Marcus looked up from the evidence he'd been organizing by lamplight, his face haggard with exhaustion and stress. "Then we need to make sure what we've found gets out, even if we don't survive. The world needs to know what happened to Maria and the others." Sarah nodded, but her attention was drawn to something Marcus had missed in their hasty examination of the bunker materials. A small digital recorder, different from the others they'd found, tucked inside Maria's personal effects container. The device looked newer than the 1990s-era equipment that had documented the experiments. This wasn't part of their official documentation, Sarah realized, turning the recorder over in her hands. Maria must have hidden this somehow. Marcus moved closer as Sarah activated the device, both of them holding their breath as the digital display showed multiple recordings dated over several weeks in late 1998. Maria's voice emerged from the small speaker, but this time she wasn't responding to questions or enduring interrogation. She was speaking directly to them across 20 years of silence. "If someone is listening to this, it means I'm probably dead, but it also means someone finally found this place. My name is Maria Montgomery, and I want my sister Sarah to know that I never blamed her for not finding me. The people who took me were professionals. They had government resources, local contacts, and a system designed to make people like me disappear without a trace. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth as tears streamed down her face. Maria's voice was weak but determined, carrying the stubborn courage that had defined her even as a child. "There are things the official records don't show," Maria continued. "Dr. Carver wasn't just experimenting on us with drugs. He was testing psychological conditioning techniques, trying to break down personality and create compliant subjects who could be used for other purposes. Some of the older kids talked about being taken to other locations to meet with people who weren't scientists." Marcus grabbed his notebook, frantically scribbling details as Maria's posthumous testimony revealed the true scope of Project Nightfall. This hadn't been just medical experimentation. It had been a comprehensive program to create assets for intelligence operations, using missing children as raw material for psychological manipulation. "The worst part isn't what they did to our bodies." Maria's voice grew stronger, as if drawing energy from her determination to bear witness. "It's what they tried to do to our minds. They wanted to erase who we were, to turn us into blank slates they could program for whatever they needed. But some of us fought back. Jenny from Portland kept a diary written in a code she taught herself. Michael from Spokane memorized every face, every name, every detail about this place. And me. I made sure to hide evidence where someone would eventually find it." The recording paused and Sarah could hear background sounds that made her stomach clench, footsteps, voices, the clinical preparation of another session. But when Maria spoke again, her voice carried an authority that belied her 16 years. "Sarah, if you're listening to this, you need to know that there are others. Not just other victims, but other facilities. Dr. Carver talked about sister sites, about expanding the program. The bunker you found isn't the only one." Marcus looked up from his notes, his journalist's instincts immediately grasping the implications. If there are other sites, there could be other victims, people who might still be alive. But Maria's final recording was the one that broke Sarah's heart and gave her the strength to continue fighting simultaneously. "I need you to know that I'm not afraid anymore. Not of dying, not of what they're going to do to me. Because I know you, Sarah. I know you'll never stop looking, never stop fighting for truth. And someday, when someone finds this place and hears my voice, they'll know that we didn't die quietly. We fought, we remembered, we made sure the truth would survive even when we couldn't." The recording ended with the sound of approaching footsteps and Maria's voice, fainter now but still defiant. "My name is Maria Montgomery. I was loved and I will be remembered." Sarah doubled over as if struck by a physical blow, 20 years of carefully controlled grief finally breaking free. But Marcus was already at the radio, his voice urgent as he contacted their allies in the valley below. "Rodriguez, Martinez, we have proof that Project Nightfall was larger than we thought. Multiple facilities, ongoing operations, possibly current victims. This isn't just about exposing past crimes, it's about stopping crimes that might still be happening." Dr. Martinez's clinical voice carried new urgency when she responded. "Sarah, I need you to upload everything to the secure server I'm sending you coordinates for. Even if Carver's people reach you, the evidence needs to survive." But before Sarah could respond, Thunder's warning whinny cut through the night air. Through the mining camp's broken windows, she could see tactical lights moving up the ridge. Their pursuers had finally tracked them to their refuge. Tommy Carver's voice crackled over the radio, tight with emotion. "My father's contractors are moving on your position. FBI is trying to intercept, but they're outnumbered. You need to move now." Sarah looked at Marcus, seeing her own resolve reflected in his exhausted face. They could run again, could try to evade capture long enough for their evidence to reach the outside world. But Maria's voice had given Sarah something she'd lost 20 years ago, the certainty that some truths were worth dying for. "No more running," she said quietly, checking her rifle and moving toward the mining camp's defensive positions. Maria didn't get the chance to fight back, but we do. Marcus nodded, understanding the decision even as he feared its consequences. Outside, the sound of approaching vehicles grew louder, and tactical flashlights began to probe the mining camp's perimeter. But as they prepared for what might be their final stand, Sarah felt her sister's presence more strongly than she had since the day Maria disappeared. Not as a ghost or memory, but as a living force that demanded justice and refused to be silenced by death or time or the machinations of powerful men who treated human lives as expendable resources. The truth about Project Nightfall would survive, even if they didn't. Maria had made sure of that with her hidden recordings, her detailed observations, her refusal to let fear silence her voice even in the face of death. As the first tactical teams reached the mining camp's perimeter, Sarah Montgomery prepared to honor her sister's legacy by fighting for the truth that Maria had died trying to preserve. The battle for justice was about to begin, and this time the victims would not go quietly into the darkness. In the valley below, their allies moved to support them, while Dr. James Carver realized that his carefully constructed new life was about to be destroyed by the voice of a 16-year-old girl who had refused to be forgotten. The dead were finally going to have their say. The mining camp erupted into chaos as tactical lights swept across the weathered buildings, and the sharp crack of gunfire shattered the mountain stillness. Sarah pressed herself against the stone wall of what had once been an assay office. Her rifle trained on the approaching shadows while Marcus crouched beside her, frantically uploading Maria's recordings to Dr. Martinez's secure server. "Upload at 60%, Marcus called out over the sound of splintering wood as bullets punched through the camp's aging structures. "The connection's slow, but it's working." Outside, professional voices coordinated the assault with military precision. These weren't local law enforcement or even federal agents. They were Dr. Carver's private contractors, men who'd been paid to ensure that Project Nightfall's secrets died with its witnesses. But Sheriff Rodriguez's voice crackled through Sarah's radio with news that changed everything. "Sarah, we've got FBI backup arriving by helicopter. Real federal agents, not Carver's people. And Tommy Carver just delivered a package to the Seattle field office that's going to make his father's night very interesting." In his downtown Seattle office, Dr. James Carver stood before a wall of monitors, showing feeds from the mountain operation, his composed facade finally cracking as reports streamed in from multiple fronts. His son had betrayed him, delivering boxes of private files that detailed not just Project Nightfall, but decades of subsequent cover-ups and the pharmaceutical empire built on stolen research. "Sir, we have federal agents at the building's main entrance," his security chief reported. "They have warrants for your arrest and seizure of company records." Carver's mind raced through contingency plans developed over 30 years of living with the fear of exposure. Offshore accounts, false identities, extraction routes that had been maintained but never used. But as he watched the tactical situation deteriorating in the mountains, he realized that some secrets were too large to escape. Back at the mining camp, Sarah heard the distinctive sound of approaching helicopters, but this time the aircraft carried legitimate federal markings and agents whose arrival changed the tactical balance. The private contractors who'd been methodically closing in on their position suddenly found themselves caught between armed civilians defending their ground and federal agents establishing a perimeter. "This is FBI Special Agent Chen," a voice boomed through a helicopter-mounted speaker. "All private security personnel stand down immediately. This is now a federal crime scene." The gunfire slackened as Carver's contractors found themselves outflanked and facing legitimate federal authority. But the brief respite gave Sarah time to complete the upload of Maria's evidence and to hear Tommy Carver's voice on the radio, heavy with the weight of family betrayal, but steady with resolve. "Sarah, I've delivered everything I could find in my father's private files to the FBI, financial records showing payments to local officials, correspondence with other pharmaceutical companies about shared research. and most importantly, locations of 3 other facilities that were part of Project Nightfall. The implications struck Sarah like a physical blow. If 3 other facilities existed, if Project Nightfall had been larger and longer running than even Maria's testimony had suggested, then dozens or possibly hundreds of victims had suffered and died while the truth remained buried. Dr. Martinez's voice joined the radio conversation, her clinical training evident in the way she organized the rapidly expanding scope of evidence. The FBI has confirmed that 2 of the facilities Tommy identified are still active. Different corporate ownership, different stated purposes, but the same core personnel and research methodologies. As federal agents secured the mining camp and took Carver's remaining contractors into custody, Sarah found herself face-to-face with Special Agent Chen, a woman whose professional demeanor couldn't quite mask her obvious anger at what the evidence revealed. "Miss Montgomery, I need you to know that what you and Mr. Webb have uncovered represents one of the most significant exposures of illegal government operations in decades. The material your sister recorded, combined with the documentation you've gathered, provides evidence of crimes that we thought had been successfully covered up." Sarah looked out at the mountain valley where she'd lived in isolation for 15 years. Suddenly seeing it not as refuge, but as the place where she'd finally found the courage to seek justice for Maria. "What happens now?" "And now we make sure that Maria Montgomery's voice is heard," Agent Chen replied firmly. "Your sister's testimony is going to bring down not just Dr. Carver, but an entire network of people who enabled and profited from Project Nightfall. In Seattle, Dr. James Carver was led from his corporate headquarters in handcuffs, his pharmaceutical empire crumbling as federal agents seized records that revealed the true foundation of his wealth. The distinguished executive who'd built a reputation on breakthrough psychiatric medications would face trial for murder, conspiracy, and crimes against humanity spanning 3 decades. But it was Tommy Carver who provided the final piece of justice that Sarah had never dared hope for. Among his father's private files were records showing that not all of Project Nightfall's victims had died in captivity. Some had been released after prolonged conditioning, their memories fragmented, but their lives intact, scattered across the country with new identities and no knowledge of what had been done to them. "We've identified 12 survivors so far," Agent Chen explained as the investigation expanded beyond anything Sarah had imagined. People who disappeared as teenagers in the 1990s and reappeared months or years later with amnesia, psychological trauma, and stories that were dismissed as mental illness or drug-related episodes. The revelation that some victims had survived, that families had been reunited without ever knowing the truth of what had happened, added layers of complexity to the justice Sarah sought. But it also meant that Maria's sacrifice had not been in vain. Her hidden testimony had not only exposed her killers, but had led to the rescue of people who might otherwise have lived their entire lives without understanding the source of their trauma. As dawn broke over the Cascade Mountains, Sarah stood beside Thunder and watched federal agents documenting the crime scene that had been her sister's prison and tomb. The horse pressed his warm nose against her shoulder in the gesture of comfort he'd perfected during their years together, and Sarah realized that her long exile was finally over. She would testify at Dr. Carver's trial, would help investigators locate and identify other victims, would work to ensure that the full scope of Project Nightfall was exposed to public scrutiny. But she would also return to these mountains, not as a refugee from the world's cruelties, but as someone who'd found the strength to face them and fight back. Sheriff Rodriguez approached as the last of the evidence was catalogued and secured. His face showed the weight of 20 years' worth of guilt, but also the relief of someone who'd finally found a way to atone for past compromises. "Sarah, I want you to know that I'm resigning as sheriff effective immediately. I took their money 20 years ago, helped cover up Maria's disappearance, and I can't represent law and order when I was part of the system that failed her. Sarah studied the man who'd been complicit in her sister's death, but had ultimately helped expose the truth. "What will you do?" "Testify. Help the federal investigators identify other cases that were compromised. Try to make sure this never happens again." Rodriguez's voice carried the determination of someone who'd found a purpose worth the cost. "It won't bring Maria back, but maybe it will prevent other families from going through what you've endured." Ndim, as the helicopters prepared to transport Sarah and Marcus back to civilization and the legal proceedings that would follow, Sarah took one last look at the mountain wilderness that had sheltered her for so long. Thunder would come with her. Their bond had been forged in isolation, but would endure in whatever new life awaited them. The truth about Project Nightfall would dominate headlines for months to come, would trigger congressional investigations and fundamental reforms in government oversight of classified research. But for Sarah Montgomery, the most important victory was simpler and more personal. Maria's voice had finally been heard. The sister, who'd never stopped believing in Sarah's ability to find her, had guided her to the truth that would ensure no other families would suffer as theirs had. Justice had been served, and the dead could finally rest in peace. 6 months after Dr. James Carver's arrest, Sarah Montgomery stood at the entrance to what had once been Project Nightfall's concrete tomb and was now the Maria Montgomery Memorial for Missing Persons. The transformation had taken months of careful planning, federal oversight, and the kind of bureaucratic coordination that Sarah had once fled to the mountains to escape. But this was different. This time, she was part of the process rather than its victim. The bunker's sterile chambers had been converted into an educational facility and resource center, its walls now bearing photographs and stories of the victims whose lives had been stolen in service of Carver's twisted research. Maria's image held the place of honor, 16 years old, smiling with the fearless confidence that had defined her too brief life. Her story told in her own words, through the recordings that had ultimately brought her killers to justice. Thunder stood patiently in the memorial's parking area, his presence a bridge between Sarah's old life of isolation and her new role as an advocate for families facing the nightmare of unexplained disappearances. The horse had adapted to his expanded duties, with the same steady calm he'd brought to their years alone in the mountains. Though Sarah could tell he preferred the quieter moments when they returned to the wilderness for the therapy sessions that had become central to her new work. The dedication ceremony went well, Dr. Rachel Martinez observed as she joined Sarah outside the memorial. Over the past months, Rachel had become more than a professional ally. She'd evolved into something Sarah had thought she'd lost forever, a genuine friend. "Maria would be proud of what you've accomplished." Sarah nodded, though her attention was focused on the small group of survivors who'd gathered for the memorial's opening. 12 individuals who'd been stolen as children and returned as damaged strangers, their memories fractured but their courage intact. Each had chosen to participate in the healing process, to reclaim their stories and help ensure that Project Nightfall's horrors were never repeated. Among them was Jennifer Chen, the Jenny from Portland, whom Maria had mentioned in her hidden recordings. Now 38, a successful artist whose paintings captured trauma and recovery with devastating honesty, she'd become a spokesperson for survivors of government experimentation. Her presence at the memorial was both vindication of Maria's testimony and proof that some wounds, while never fully healed, could be transformed into sources of strength. Sarah. Sheriff David Rodriguez approached with the careful deference of someone still earning forgiveness for past compromises. His resignation had been accepted, but he'd found new purpose working with federal investigators to identify other cases that had been corrupted by Project Nightfall's network. "The FBI wants to brief you on the latest developments." The investigation had expanded far beyond what Sarah had initially uncovered. 3 other facilities in different states, dozens of additional victims, and a web of complicity that reached into pharmaceutical companies, government agencies, and academic institutions Dr. Carver's conviction on 47 counts of murder had been just the beginning. The trials and revelations would continue for years to come. But it was the personal transformations that mattered most to Sarah. Marcus Webb had found sobriety and renewed purpose as the journalist documenting Project Nightfall's full scope. His obsession with Maria's case finally vindicated by evidence that had stood up in federal court. Tommy Carver had testified against his father with quiet dignity, his park ranger position providing crucial access to evidence that had sealed the prosecution's case. Each had paid a price for their involvement. Marcus's liver bore the scars of decades of alcoholism. Tommy faced the permanent estrangement from family members who couldn't accept his father's guilt. Rodriguez lived with the knowledge that his early compromises had enabled years of additional suffering. But they'd also found something Sarah recognized from her own journey, the peace that came from finally confronting the truth, regardless of its cost. The federal task force is expanding its mandate, Rodriguez explained as they walked through the memorial's exhibits. They want to establish a permanent unit focused on historical cases of government experimentation. You'd have a consulting role, helping families navigate the investigation process. Sarah considered the offer while studying Maria's photograph. Her sister's eyes seemed to hold the same determination that had driven her to hide evidence even while facing death. The same refusal to accept injustice that had ultimately exposed Project Nightfall's architects. "I'll do it," Sarah decided. "But I want guarantees that families will have real support, not just bureaucratic promises. And I want the wilderness therapy program expanded. There are too many survivors who need healing that can't happen in conference rooms and courthouses." The program Sarah had developed combined her search and rescue expertise with therapeutic principles, taking trauma survivors into the mountains where they could confront their fears in an environment of natural beauty and challenge. It was unconventional, sometimes controversial among traditional mental health professionals, but the results spoke for themselves. Participants found strength they hadn't known they possessed, developed trust in their own abilities, and began to see themselves as survivors rather than victims. Thunder had proven invaluable to the program, his calm presence and intuitive responses to human emotion providing a form of therapy that no human counselor could replicate. Former victims who couldn't trust people found they could trust the horse, who'd been Sarah's companion through her own healing journey. "There's something else," Dr. Martinez said as they concluded the memorial tour. "The Department of Justice wants to establish a victim compensation fund, but they need someone with credibility to oversee the application process. Someone the survivors trust." The irony wasn't lost on Sarah, she who'd fled human. Contact for 15 years, was now being asked to serve as an intermediary between traumatized individuals and the government, agencies that had failed them. But perhaps that was exactly why she was the right person for the role. She understood the suspicion, the fear of being betrayed again, the difficulty of trusting institutions that had proven themselves capable of systematic evil. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the mountain peaks, Sarah found herself alone in the memorial's central chamber, the room where Maria had been tortured and had ultimately died. The space had been transformed, no longer sterile and threatening, but warm and welcoming, filled with natural light and living plants that spoke of growth and renewal. Maria's voice played softly from speakers hidden throughout the room, her final testimony serving as both memorial and promise. "My name is Maria Montgomery. I was loved, and I will be remembered." Sarah closed her eyes and felt her sister's presence more strongly than she had since that terrible day 20 years ago, when a 16-year-old girl had simply vanished from a mountain trail. But this presence wasn't the ghost that had haunted Sarah's isolation. It was the living force of love and justice that had guided her through the darkness and into the light of truth. "I found you, Maria," Sarah whispered to the empty room. "It took too long, but I found you." Outside, Thunder whinnied softly, reminding Sarah that others were waiting for her. The survivors who'd driven hours to attend the memorial dedication. The families still searching for answers about their own missing loved ones. The investigators and advocates who were working to ensure that Project Nightfall represented the end of an era rather than a single exposed operation. As Sarah emerged from the memorial into the gathering dusk, she saw the lights of vehicles beginning their journeys home, back to lives that had been forever changed by the truth she'd helped uncover. Some would struggle with the knowledge of what had been done to them or their loved ones. Others would find strength in finally having answers to questions that had tormented them for decades. But all of them would carry forward Maria's legacy, the understanding that some truths were worth any sacrifice to preserve. That justice delayed was not justice denied, and that love could transcend even death when it was strong enough to refuse silence. Sarah mounted Thunder and turned toward the mountain trail that would take them back to her cabin. No longer a refuge from the world, but a retreat where she could recharge between her expanded duties as advocate, consultant and guide for others, walking the difficult path between trauma and healing. The wilderness that had hidden her for 15 years would now serve a different purpose, becoming a place of healing for others who needed to rediscover their strength and resilience. The mountains that had witnessed her sister's disappearance would also witness the recovery of those who'd survived similar horrors. As they climbed higher into the backcountry, Sarah felt the familiar peace that came from being in harmony with the natural world. But it was different now. Not the desperate flight from human connection that had driven her into isolation, but the conscious choice of someone who'd learned to balance solitude with service, healing with justice, personal peace with public responsibility. Thunder's steady hoofbeats marked the rhythm of their ascent, and Sarah found herself thinking not about the past, but about the future. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, testimony in ongoing trials, consultations with investigators, therapy sessions with survivors who were just beginning their own journeys toward healing. But tonight, she would rest in the wilderness that had shaped her, surrounded by the silence that no longer felt empty, but full of possibility. Maria's voice would always echo in these mountains, not as a cry for help that went unanswered, but as a testament to the power of truth to survive even the most determined efforts to bury it. The memorial would serve future generations as both warning and promise. Warning about the capacity for institutional evil. Promise that individual courage could still triumph over systematic oppression. Students would study the exhibits, researchers would build upon the evidence, and families would find comfort in knowing that their loved ones' stories had meaning and purpose. As the first stars appeared in the mountain sky, Sarah Montgomery rode toward home with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd finally found her place in the world. Not as a hermit fleeing from human contact, but as a bridge between the wild places that had taught her to survive and the civilized world that needed her particular form of wisdom. Thunder's ears pricked forward as they approached the cabin, and Sarah smiled at his obvious pleasure in returning to familiar territory. They would spend the night in the peace of the mountains, but tomorrow they would return to the world of people who needed healing, justice, and the kind of hope that could only come from knowing that truth, however long delayed, would eventually prevail. Maria Montgomery's legacy lived on, not just in the memorial that bore her name or the trials that had convicted her killers, but in every life touched by the courage she'd shown in refusing to be forgotten. The 16-year-old girl who died alone in a concrete bunker had ultimately saved dozens of lives and prevented countless future tragedies through the simple act of bearing witness to the truth. And Sarah, the sister who'd blamed herself for failing to find Maria in time, had discovered that sometimes the most important discoveries come not when we're searching for the lost, but when we're finally ready to be found ourselves. The mountain night settled around them with its familiar embrace, and Sarah Montgomery rode home to prepare for whatever new challenges tomorrow would bring, secure in the knowledge that she would face them not alone, but supported by the unbreakable bond of sisterly love that had finally found its way to justice and peace. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.